Welcome to The Kingstonian, a podcast that profiles people who are passionate about what they do for a living, what organization they belong to, or the community they are a part of. Here is your host, Dave Cunningham.
Thank you, Steve. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Brian Mulroney served as the 18th Prime Minister of Canada from 1984 to 1993. He passed away on February 29th, 2024, at the age of 84. A lot has been written and reported on his life and career, and in this episode, something different. I called upon a frequent guest of the podcast, Canadian political historian Arthur Milnes. Arthur is qualified to comment on Brian Mulroney's career and legacy. He was also a friend and had been since the former Prime Minister invited him over lunch in Montreal to act as his assistant in compiling his memoirs. Brian Mulroney had no problem taking on the big issues when he was Prime Minister, but he also made time for phone calls to a few 10-year-olds doing class projects on Canadian politicians. That aspect is one of the things Arthur and I explore in this conversation. Arthur, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks again, Dave, for having me.
Now, I know that Brian Mulroney was more than just an employer to you. He became a friend. And so, given that, let me extend my sympathies to you on his passing. We want to talk a little bit about your interactions with Brian, and let's start off with how the two of you met.
Oh, boy. That could take an hour there, Dave. I met him as a reporter. When I was young, the Pembroke Observer, and the local mayor in Pembroke, Terry McCann, I still call him mayor when I talk to him, had been Mr. Mulroney's debating partner at St. Yves. So Mr. Mulroney's nickname in the university was Bones because he was so tall and lanky. And the mayor of Pembroke's nickname back then was Ace McCann. So I sent a request, it was 1994, so Mr. Mulroney had just left office, and he wasn't talking to the media, which was interesting. And I said, I want an interview, but I don't care about free trade or Meech Lake or your relations with the Americans or apartheid. I don't care about anything. All I will ask about is the mayor of Pembroke. So then, about a week later, my phone rang in the newsroom, and I'll never forget it as long as I live, and I can even still quote it. So I picked up the phone and I said, Arthur Milnes, and then this voice said, Arthur, it's Bones. I understand you want to talk about Ace. So we did, and I still have it, but I'll never forget it. The headline, front page of the Pembroke Observer, which I still treasure, and it said, Mulroney praises Pembroke Ace. And the night Mr. Mulroney died, the next day, my first phone call was to Mayor McCann, and we had a nice chat about our fallen friend. And then when I came to the Kingston Week Standard, my interests as a reporter were actually more interested in prime ministerial history than they were in the daily murders and shootings and other things you have to write about at a paper. So I would send Mr. Mulroney interview requests, and again I didn't want to talk about anything except history, and in particular I wanted to talk about his hero. His hero in life was Sir John A. Macdonald of Kingston. So I never got an interview. And so I would send off a request about once a year. And young people won't believe this, but I actually used snail mail back then. And I sent off a letter. And in between, maybe a week later, my mother-in-law phoned me.
I heard this story. I love this one.
Yeah. And she said, Art, guess who I ran into at Pearson Airport tonight? She lived in Toronto. And I said, who's that? And she said, Brian Mulroney, and I gave him a piece of my mind for not talking to you. And I said, I thought, oh my God, I'm never going to get
there's my career.
An interview with Brian Mulroney. And I said, what did he say? Right? And she said, I'll never forget it. She said, he told me to tell you that now that he's met the in-laws, he'll talk to you. So sure enough, Dave, again, I can remember it like yesterday. I went to the Whig Standard early the next morning to get to work, and my message machine was flashing, and I picked it up, and again, I can quote it from memory. And the voice said, Arthur, it's Brian Mulroney. I'm calling at the behest of my new best friends, your in-laws. Let's talk. So literally, that's how it started. And he would often phone me after that on Sundays. And again, I just talked about history, and we would talk. He like me was a geek, okay, a history geek, and we would one day talk about R.B. Bennett, and then another time about Sir Wilfrid Laurier, and then of course John A. Macdonald, his hero, my hero too. Yeah. And what I didn't know. Oh, and sorry, I forgot to. I would ask him every once in a while. Why hadn't he done his memoirs? Right? And I would say, look, you're a conservative, so don't expect any of those, crazy professors at Queen's to write a book about you. It's not happening. They won't do it ever. So I kept saying that to him. And one time I just wrote him a 5 or 6 page memo. I can't remember how big it was, just about what every other prime minister since 1867 had written as a past prime minister. And what I didn't know, Dave, during all of this, is he was interviewing me. But I didn't know. And so after about 3 or 4 months, and my wife used to say, if she answered the phone, she'd say, "Oh, Art, it's your friend from Montreal again." But anyway, so his assistant called me and said, could I have lunch with Mr. Mulroney in Montreal? It was just before Christmas. So down I went and met him at his law office. And then, I even forget what lunch or what restaurant or private club, it didn't matter. I was pretty nervous. And we, walked over and entered the place. And before we'd even got to the table, he turned to me and he said, well, Arthur, I'm about to start my memoirs and I'd like you to join me as my assistant. And you want to know my first reaction? I said, wow. I said, you can do bigger than me. Right? And he laughed and he said, well, I didn't expect that response. Right? So anyway, so that led to 5 years. I was his memoirs, his only assistant as he worked on his memoirs, and spent hundreds of hours with him. And
there's one thing about Brian Mulroney is that when you hear his voice on the telephone, you know who's calling. He had a distinctive voice, and from a person who worked in radio for years, it was a great radio voice. Let's talk a little bit about his history. And I was reading a little bit about him, and I didn't realize that he was very much involved in politics even when he was at university.
Oh, it was quite his. You know what, Dave? Some of the I got to read his private archives that won't be open to the public probably for another 50 or 60 years. So I was the first one to be able to read those files, and I was particularly fascinated with exactly what you've asked about, his early years as a student and his the role he played, which actually for a 19, 20-year-old was pretty important. He was a great, as a student, as a young man, he was very confident in his abilities. And more importantly, he was listened to by some of the most senior politicians, a couple of premiers of Quebec. And most importantly, John Diefenbaker, the prime minister. And I'll never forget, again, opening a file in his archives, and I think it was 1961 or 2. And there was a 5-page fax from this student to Prime Minister Diefenbaker. And it started off, "Dear Chief, as per our conversation last night." And Mr. Mulroney, then the student, went on for 5 pages to tell Dief how much Dief was doing wrong in the province of Quebec. So it was a pretty remarkable for a young man. And then because the Conservatives back then, ever since the death of Louis Riel in the 1885, Conservatives had quite a black cloud hanging over them in Quebec. When Riel was hanged, that was considered a real shot against French Canadians. And so Mr. Mulroney, he knew that if the Conservatives, to be successful, they had to come to terms with Quebec. And he had been making that argument since he was 19 or 20. And he therefore became very important within the party in Quebec in his 20s. Electoral advisor to Bob Stanfield. And then in 1976, again, he'd never been elected. He ran for the leadership of the Progressive Conservative Party. And as he would say later in life, luckily for him, he lost and Joe Clark won. And because they were, his view was they were both too young. And in Mr. Mulroney's case, he didn't see it at the time because it was bad on him. It was rough. But as he got older, he realized the bitterness led to good things. He quit drinking, for example, just stopped one day in 1980. And he, by being defeated, and I would argue most great leaders, part of being a great leader that helps you is if you've had a crushing defeat. Mm-hmm. And most of the great ones have. Laurier, MacDonald, Mackenzie King, Diefenbaker lost time after time after time until he won. And it really, they all look back on it. Mr. Harper, he was crushed when he was defeated in 2004. And that Paul Martin was crushed for the Liberal leadership in 1990. So a defeat can be a very, very helpful thing in the long
Let's
term.
talk about a win. And he gets into government and pick a couple of different issues that you think were important in terms of what he brought forward and why he brought them forward.
Well, based on what I was saying is his breakthrough in Quebec in 1984. Mm-hmm. He when he ran for leadership in 1976, he tried to appeal to the country while he was running for leader. But in 83, he learned his lesson. The only people that mattered were 3,000 delegates across Canada. And if you think the primary race in the United States is rough, I mean, a Canadian party leader in the era of delegated conventions, you have to go to their homes. You have to go to Yellowknife, St. John's, Kingston, everywhere in between. So what he told them was this. He said, if the Progressive Conservative Party doesn't come to terms with French Canada, we will never reach the heights of power. And I'm the guy to do it. And so that was in the lead up to 84. That was his message, and it worked. And the Progressive Conservatives won 58 seats in 1984. I think it was 58, which was incredible. And then all told, his party won 211 seats. And during his brief period as leader of the opposition, on the same theme, Pierre Trudeau and the Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau and the Liberals thought they were setting a trap for Brian Mulroney, the new leader, Brian Mulroney. On his first day in the House of Commons, Prime Minister Trudeau dropped on him that he wanted all party support to fight for French Canadian rights in Manitoba in the West. And some of Mr. Mulroney's backbench, the Liberals knew wouldn't be open to what Mr. Trudeau was proposing. Well, Brian Mulroney wasn't stupid. And he came out full-throated for French Canadian rights and told those members of his backbench, too bad. If you don't support official bilingualism, it's the law of the land. If you don't support it, get out of my party. And then they tried it again. The Liberals passed had the vote on the Canada Health Act, universal medical care. Actually, it's the 40th anniversary this month of the Canada Health Act passing. And they figured, we're going to snag this Mulroney guy because there's so many members of the Conservative Party who don't support full Medicare, and they want extra billing by doctors. And Mulroney said the same thing to his caucus. He said, you don't support universal medical care, you don't support Medicare, you don't support the reforms the Liberals are doing, then get out of my caucus. And they stayed in line, did they ever? And they won.
That brings up something with respect to the way that a leader runs his caucus and keeps control of his caucus and the loyalty, because I'm sure that there is a wide spectrum of individuals who get elected to represent constituencies across Canada, and they come from various backgrounds and they may not always agree, but you need a good leader to be able to control the crew and make sure that everybody's going the same way.
Well, Mr. Mulroney, as you know, was a master of caucus relations. And one thing I'll never forget reading in his private papers is just when he got elected leader, an old Diefenbaker cabinet minister named George Heath from Cobourg, just down the 401. He wrote to the new leader and he said, here's something Diefenbaker never did. So you need to watch the House once a week, and you need to phone and write notes to your backbenchers when they give a good speech or ask a good question in the House. And Mr. Mulroney was already there, but he did that. He made sure that he was well aware of the activities in the House of Commons. He would often go there early before a question period to see what his troops were saying. He also had weekly, sometimes daily breakfasts and lunches with his MPs. And I read his private files, and there was no bigger crime in Brian Mulroney's Ottawa. There was no bigger crime than a cabinet minister who didn't treat one of Mr. Mulroney's MPs with respect, and bring them into the tent. And boy, did some of those ministers suffer when they didn't do that. I remember once a year, Mr. Mulroney would have his, every member of his caucus would write a letter, and they would set up a private post office box. So those letters were never opened by anybody except Prime Minister Mulroney. And there was one of them I remember reading where this backbencher was a parliamentary secretary, kind of a junior assistant to a minister. And there had been a trip somewhere for some sort of announcement by the minister. And the MP wrote, he said, look, I got elected and the minister is in first class on the plane. I'm in steerage class. It was a commercial flight. And sitting up with the minister are all these unelected bureaucrats. Brian Mulroney went nuts on that minister. And that never, ever happened again.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I can recall in the conversation I had on the podcast with Hugh Segal, and he was Brian Mulroney's chief of staff for a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And when he took on that role, one of the things that Brian Mulroney told Hugh Segal was to take the little Post-it notes that Brian had put in his pocket when he had conversations with his members of parliament and make sure there was follow-up done with those little Post-it notes. The other thing that I found interesting too is that the prime minister told his chief of staff, when you think it's time for me to go, let me know. So that ended up happening at one particular point in his tenure as prime minister, and it was time for him to leave politics. Based upon your readings and conversations, how did that decision come about in the prime minister's mind?
Well, he was in a bind, right? When I read that, read some stuff, not since he's died, in fairness, but stuff earlier about how he stayed too long and all these things. Well, he was in a bind, and Hugh Segal actually was involved in this. Very proud of Hugh over this. Sadly, the Meech Lake Constitutional Court had failed, and feelings of separatism in Quebec were, shot through the roof because of that. And Mr. Mulroney, he bided his time, and then he brought the premiers back with Indigenous leaders, and this is like 40 years ago. Okay, so anybody who thinks we've discovered all this stuff today hasn't read any history books. So he brought them all together, and they crafted a new constitutional deal, and there was a national referendum, and it looked out of the starting gate that they'd probably lose. And Hugh Segal wrote him a memo I'll never forget, and he said, "We have to take the bullet out of the chamber," meaning the Charlottetown referendum. And he was right. So yes, while the Accord didn't go through, Canadians rejected it, except for Ontario, actually. But Canadians rejected it. But after that, for the immediate, like I said, the bullet was out of the chamber, or was taken out. So that was in 1992, right? And had he left earlier, that wouldn't have happened. He was key to Quebec. And though a lot of Quebecers might disagree with him on sovereignty and other things, he was a native son, and they knew that he was fighting for them. So that was the fall, October 26, 1992. I remember it like yesterday myself. And he announced his resignation in February 93. So it's that's a brutal. It's a decision that only the prime minister can make.
Yeah.
Nobody can make that.
Yeah.
And some get it right, some get it wrong. But it's intensely. It's not just personal. There's a whole bunch of factors you have to take into account. And if we're going to criticize Brian Mulroney for staying too long, if we're going to do that, then we also have to criticize Pierre Trudeau for doing it. His party was decimated after he left office a few months before. We have to, criticize Sir John A. Macdonald himself, who probably shouldn't have run that last campaign in 1891, where they shouted, "Sir John, you'll never die." Well, he did right after, and his party fell apart. So Wilfrid Laurier probably stayed too long. The only two successful handoffs in Canadian history, I would argue political history, would be Mackenzie King defied the odds. He was 22 years as prime minister. He handed off to Louis Saint-Laurent, and the Liberals stayed in power another decade. And then Lester Pearson himself, he knew when to go, and he engineered the Liberal Party leadership victory of an very much unknown professor from Montreal named Pierre Trudeau. So it's very rare for a prime minister in Canadian history to succeed at that. And as I said, it was only Mr. Pearson and Mr. King really who did it.
So Brian Mulroney leaves office.
Well, he became a very much, since we're talking about history, very much in the manner of Robert Borden, who also lived on a long time after he was prime minister. Mr. Mulroney became a very important force in both the Canadian business community, but probably in many ways, more importantly, in the international community. And nobody, whether they were past leaders, current leaders, nobody refused a call from Brian Mulroney. I know that because I was sitting in the room sometimes. Right? And I can't say who, but you would be, you might be surprised at the power he had. I remember about 20 years ago, a headline in the Globe and Mail with a picture of Mr. Mulroney, and it said, "Now he has real power." And he was quite remarkable. And then he also did a great deal of charity work that didn't get a lot of headlines. And he also often crossed party lines. And when a Canadian prime minister or a cabinet minister would contact him privately he would do what he could with his contacts to help Canada's case, particularly in the United States, but also internationally and generally. But one great love of his life, the rest of his life, was his support for St. Francis Xavier University in Nova Scotia, where he did his undergraduate degree. And he always said that had he not gone to St. FX, he would have never been prime minister. Mm-hmm. So you'd have to check the exact numbers, but if I remember, he raised $60 or $70 million for that tiny little university, and they now have the Brian Mulroney Institute, which is it's the only undergraduate public policy school in the country. Very unique, and that was very much his true love in life, besides his family. And it's I'm glad now that he's passed that he was alive to see it open.
Mm-hmm. I have the impression, and it's not based on any fact, it's just my assessment personally, that if you have been a leader of a political party or a prime minister, and you've been in that role for some time, and you've done good things, and you've done some things that weren't as successful as you might have wanted them to be, that once you leave office, I would think the next generation of leader would not necessarily go to you for advice because you were history, you were past, you were not necessarily current with a lot of things that were going on. But he seems to have defied the odds, and people went to him and asked him for his advice, and he stayed current in their minds. Fair assessment?
Oh, 100%. It was the party leaders who weren't smart that didn't go see him.
Yeah.
But the smart ones from the NDP, he had a great close relationship, for example, with Jack Layton, right. Now late leader of the NDP. And boy, did Layton beat a path to Mr. Mulroney's door as he was preparing for that election where Jack Layton defied the odds, mm-hmm. and won 103 seats, best showing that the NDP has ever had. He did the same with conservative leaders, with liberals as well. You would be shocked. Some people would be shocked when you watch Question Period and you watch them shouting at each other. Mr. Mulroney was the master of he treated people with decency, and if there's one thing, I don't think I'm revealing anything too confidential or anything, but if there's one thing that Mr. Mulroney didn't like in recent years was the tone and meanness of politics. Mm-hmm. He wouldn't like that.
Yeah.
And now he had battles, don't get me wrong, but here's the thing I look back on, and I've told people what I had the great privilege. I was also, while I was working for Mr. Mulroney, I was also a friend of John Turner's, another great leader that I admired greatly and always will. And in 5 years, Dave, with Brian Mulroney, I never not once, heard him say a personal negative thing about John Turner, ever. And I was also, during that period, I would often have lunch or see Mr. Turner, often here in Kingston, actually. And same thing. Now, did they agree on policy X and policy Y, particularly free trade? No.
Yeah.
But I look back on it, Dave, and I was a student in 1988 when the issue of the day was free trade with the United States. Again, groundbreaking, important issue for all Canadians at that time. So here you had John Turner, incredibly articulate, effective man, and Brian Mulroney, the prime minister. Mr. Turner opposed, Mr. Mulroney for. And for 7 weeks, these leaders, I can't even imagine it today. They ran around Canada for 7 weeks. And guess what they did, Dave? Yes. They talked about an issue. An issue. There was no nasty tweets and that. It was an issue that mattered. And these two men put their careers on the line for it.
Yeah.
And though Mr. Mulroney won and John Turner lost? I would actually argue, as I look back on it, nobody lost. That Canada won because both sides were so effectively, thanks to the leadership of these two men, both sides were heard. And what do they argue about today, Dave? I don't know.
One of the things I'm always amazed about is the difference between what happens with a former prime minister of Canada versus a former president of the United States and the way they interact with the public. There doesn't seem to, in my mind, I don't understand why, but I guess it just illustrates the difference between the two countries, is that there isn't a big security force following around former prime ministers.
Let me, I'd respond to that with two quick stories. Well, first off, my general comment is, and I don't like saying this, but Canada, I love Canada. It's my country. I think we're the greatest country on earth, but we can be really small sometimes, really small. And in the way we treat our past leaders is a prime example. Other countries, more mature countries, understand the value of a past leader and have more respect for that post, that position in society. Canadian prime ministers get utterly no support, none at all. They don't even get free stamps. And privately, some will tell you that it actually costs them a lot of money, because not all of them are rich, cost them a lot of money to be an ex-prime minister, right? But two quick stories. So John Turner was prime minister, and he lost the election on September 4th, 1984 to Mr. Mulroney. And but he was reelected and he was elected in his own seat. So he started the morning at 24 Sussex as Prime Minister of Canada with a huge entourage, and then he had to go over across the street to Rideau Hall to officially resign as Prime Minister and recommend Brian Mulroney as his replacement. That's what Prime Minister does. And he wanted to walk across the street, okay? And the RCMP said, no, you can't. So they took like a 5-car motorcade across the street, and he tendered his resignation, walked back outside. Mr. Turner told me this once, walked back outside, and there was only one car now, and it was just a regular RCMP cruiser. The limousines were gone. And they drove him to Parliament Hill, and they pulled up under the center block, or at the center block, and they said, here's your stop, sort of thing. And John Turner got out. He no longer had any security or assistance, and he didn't even know where his office was. Can you imagine that happening to an American or a French president? And another story that shows this is something I worry about is former Prime Minister Clark years ago was a former prime minister walking down the street in Montreal on St. Catherine Street. And a gentleman approached him and said, "Oh, are you Joe Clark?" And Mr. Clark said, "Yes." And the man punched Mr. Clark in the face. And this is serious stuff. And we need to provide more support to our past prime ministers. I've always thought they should be appointed non-voting senators, members of the Senate, but that's a whole other issue. But yeah, so these prime ministers have incredible, if you look at, let's just look at Stephen Harper, for example. So, folks can like Stephen Harper, people can dislike him. But when it comes for Canada, he spent 10 years basically around the G7 table, the most important political economic club on earth. The rest of the world wants his advice. Right? Yeah. And, the same with Mr. Mulroney, the same with Mr. Chrétien. It will be the same with Mr. Trudeau in the future. And, these prime ministers matter, former prime ministers matter. And I don't know, it's a Canadian thing. Yeah. That I've never understood. So.
We are recording this conversation in mid-March 2024, and just before Mr. Mulroney's state funeral, which comes up this Saturday. And I thought I'd get you to tell us a little bit about state funerals and just what they are all about and the honor that is bestowed on an individual when they do get one of those.
Well, we're in Kingston, so we've seen that. The city of Kingston might try to deny that John A. Macdonald ever existed today, but too bad. When his body was brought home from Ottawa after his death in June of 1891, approximately 20,000 people, double Kingston's population, filed through and paid their final respects to Sir John A. Now, the first state funeral in Canadian history was for the great Thomas D'Arcy McGee, the poet of Confederation. And he was assassinated in 1868. And just before he died, his last moments, he died was shot right after giving a speech in the House of Commons. And he left some advice for all prime ministers who followed. And he said, and I can exactly quote it, "He who seeks after popularity builds upon a shifting sand." And his state funeral, there were ceremonies in Ottawa. Then his body was taken to Montreal, his home and home riding. 80,000 people turned out for Mr. McGee's funeral and procession. And there were two services. There's one at the French-speaking Basilica, and one in English as well. But probably the most elaborate, and one I love talking about, so you might want to cut me off, Dave, is Sir John Thompson. Well, today most people probably don't even know who Sir John Thompson was. Well, he was our fourth prime minister, and he died at Windsor Castle minutes after being sworn into the Imperial Privy Council by Queen Victoria herself. So he died at Windsor Castle. So picture this, Dave, a Victorian era prime minister, and you die at Windsor Castle. Like, it doesn't get any better, okay? And then Her Majesty, because Sir John Thompson was Roman Catholic, she ordered up the first Catholic mass held at Windsor Castle since the Reformation. Then she sent his body. She provided the royal train to take his body to London and then to Portsmouth for the trip home to Canada. She ordered a British man of war that was dispatched from Gibraltar, painted black. And so Sir John Thompson, began his journey home. And as he left, as the ship HMS Blenheim left Halifax Harbor, the Nelson's flagship itself, HMS Victory, fired a salute. So, like I said, if you're going to be a Victorian Prime Minister, Dave, and you're going to die, John Thompson did it best. He would have loved anybody. Every Prime Minister since is probably jealous what Sir John Thompson's send-off was, So, and then Mr. Diefenbaker, that in modern times, Mr. Diefenbaker is the most elaborate, and he spent years planning it. He helped represent Canada at Sir Winston Churchill's funeral, and boy, did he take notes. and the old Dief, he died in Ottawa, and then they had a funeral train take him all the way home to Saskatchewan, and it stopped at every station in every town, and thousands came out to salute the Dief. And so it on these state funerals for a prime minister, and we've seen it since Mr. Mulroney died on February 29th, they're very much unifying events. And, the media and the professors at Queen's can be cynical about this kind of stuff, but for Canadians, it actually matters. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing that right now. I think I said earlier, it's been unifying. We've seen Canadians from all stations of life come out, and whether a lot of them didn't vote for him, but they honor Mr. Mulroney's public service and his contributions, and that's the way it should be.
Now, given your association with him over the years, how will you remember Brian Mulroney?
Oh, there's so many ways, but this won't surprise you, I don't think, Dave, but the phone calls. I never, up until I talked to him a week or so before he died, I never knew when he would call. And I spent more time while we were working on the memoirs. I spent more time on the phone with Brian Mulroney over at the Kingston Center Loblaws. My wife and I used to joke. He always used to seem to phone when I was in Loblaws. And he also, as I said, he was very much helped me get through the night my father died. He phoned my wife when she's never forgotten. He phoned her from South Africa once to wish her well on her final teaching exams. And one thing that the public never saw was here in Kingston was often during that period, my friends knew I was working for Mr. Mulroney on his memoirs. So back then, the grade 5 unit did a segment on prime ministers, and the kids would have to pick a prime minister to study for the projects. And these parents would phone me and ask if I would take time and help their kid. And what they didn't know was I would get off the phone with them, and I'd phone Mr. Mulroney. And I said, I would say, sir, there's a grade 5 kid in Kingston doing a project on prime ministers, and his parents wondered if you could help. I never told them that it was actually, they wanted me to help. And a couple of days later, I would always get a phone call from the parents, probably happened 7 or 8 times. And Mr. Mulroney had phoned the house and not asking for mom and dad, the adults. He'd ask for the kid. And he spent hours on the phone speaking to young Kingstonians and others, helping them with their project. And then in fairness, later in my career, I worked as a speechwriter for Stephen Harper, and I saw him do that with young people. And I'm sure Justin Trudeau does that today as well. Mm-hmm. It's prime ministers themselves were ambitious young people, or they wouldn't have got the job.
Yeah.
And they respect that in young people. They would write to them and phone them, and it's wonderful to watch the impacts that these prime ministers and past prime ministers have on young people. Another thing I did, I worked for Tom Axworthy, Pierre Trudeau's chief of staff at Queen's for a while, and once a year, I would often take some of Tom's students down to Montreal, and they would spend 2 or 3 hours with Brian Mulroney, and what an experience for a young student. And what I liked is they were younger, so they had no preconceived thoughts or notions of Prime Minister Mulroney. All they knew, it would be like you and me in our youth being taken to see Louis Saint Laurent. All they knew was they were with history, and boy, I wish I could have tape recorded or filmed those sessions with Mr. Mulroney and those young people. You know,
that would have been good.
So those would probably be my greatest memories. And also, I just, I would, my other favorite moments were when we'd be working at his house and we'd put the recording material and the papers away, and we just talk.
Yeah.
We just talk. And when that was done, he'd walk me to the door, and he'd say goodbye, and I'd get in my car and I'd drive back to Kingston, and I'd think then, as I am the moment he died, I'd think then how privileged and lucky that I was to know and love such a remarkable man.
Mm-hmm. Good way to end it. Thank you, Art. Appreciate it. My guest in this episode, journalist and political historian Arthur Milnes, reminiscing about his friend, former Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Brian Mulroney, who passed away 2 weeks ago. This podcast was recorded in March of 2024. Thank you to those of you who have taken the time to listen, and I'll be back soon with another conversation.
The theme music for the podcast is Stasis Oasis, written and performed by Kingston musician Tim Aylesworth. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about any of the episodes, please send a note to the kingstonianpodcast@gmail.com. For details on upcoming guests, follow us on Facebook. The Kingstonian Podcast is hosted by Dave Cunningham and produced in Kingston, Ontario, Canada.